Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2023 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook of The Power of the People, Homeless Protesters in the Aftermath of Social Movement Participation by David Wagner and Marcia B. Cohen from 1991. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. I also want to point out that this video is part of the Homeless Industrial Complex video playlist that we're putting together here at Socialism for All. This is based off of the Homeless Industrial Complex Syllabus for Fighting Back by Annie Powers and Tracy Rosenthal. You can find that at bit.ly/carceral housing, CARCERAL housing. There's a link to that in the description. That's not only a list of the readings, it's actually all of the readings in PDF or other form so that you can get all of these, something like 50 different readings, and read them at your convenience. I'll put that link in the video description and in a pinned comment. And this particular reading closes out section 2 out of 11, which is titled Organized Encampments Produce Communal Safety in the Face of Abandonment. So, that said, we begin with a prefatory note. An earlier version of this article was presented at the American Sociological Association annual conference in Cincinnati, Ohio, August 1991. The authors wish to thank the leaders of the Coalition for the Dignity of the Homeless and Poor in Portland, Maine, for their critical assistance, as well as the many homeless and formerly homeless subjects who gave so much of their time to talk with us. Additionally, we wish to thank the anonymous reviewers of Social Problems Journal, who through their comments were instrumental in the development of this piece. The authors also thank Joel Blau, Richard Cloward, and Francis Fox Piven for sharing manuscript drafts of their work with the authors. And there's an address for correspondence, I'm not sure if it's still current, Wagner, Department of Social Welfare, University of Southern Maine, Portland, Maine, 04103. So, now on to the abstract. Research on homelessness and recent social movement literature have focused little attention on protest movements among the homeless and very poor. Indeed, most writing in this area concludes that this population is disempowered and disenfranchised. In this article, the impact of a tent city protest on homeless participants is analyzed through an ethnographic study based on interviews and participant observation with street people 3 years later. The authors suggest that local social movements can have a significant impact on low-income people's access to material and non-material resources. Differences and similarities between poor people's movements and middle-class movements are also examined. Despite growing protest and political consciousness among groups of homeless people, the pitched battles in New York City's Tompkins Square Park, years of confrontation in Washington, D.C., led by the Coalition for Creative Nonviolence, and dozens of localized tent cities and sit-ins, neither social scientists studying the homeless nor social movement theorists have investigated the impact of protest on the lives of the very poor. Based on an ethnographic study of homeless people engaged in a militant tent city in a northeastern city, we suggest that with just minimal resources and organizational structure, homeless and very poor people can achieve considerable success in affecting resource distribution on a local level. Moreover, we argue that engagement in protest movements can have a dramatic impact on the lives of participants in movements for the poor. Hidden movements of poor people. As homelessness has emerged as a growing social problem, a considerable body of both popular and academic literature has developed. Most research on homelessness has been descriptive in nature, focused on estimating the dimension and severity of homelessness and determining the demographic characteristics of the population. Researchers have conducted numerous head counts to identify, categorize, and dispute the number of homeless people locally and nationally. Although much important data have been gathered, research on homeless people has tended to portray them as passive victims, people who are acted upon, rather than conscious actors on the social scene. As Hodge and Slayton note, because the rediscovery of homelessness as a social problem in the 1980s occurred in the context of a conservative national administration committed to ignoring or minimizing the problem, much of the literature and many advocates for the homeless portray them as vulnerable victims. Most recent research has persuasively argued the social structural causes of homelessness: the housing market, the benefit cutbacks of the 1980s, deindustrialization, and unemployment. While such research, quoting Hodge and Slayton, quote, has relieved the homeless of moral responsibility for their condition, it casts them, the homeless, as passive and dependent subjects of care, unquote. Indeed, typically homeless people or subgroups of the homeless are identified as vulnerable, isolated, or disaffiliated. Social scientists often present the homeless population as politically disempowered and disabled. Marjorie Hope and James Young in 1986, for example, in an otherwise sympathetic account, state, quote, anyone who has worked with the homeless knows that they are not likely to organize well. They're usually physically exhausted, confused, and at least on the surface, apathetic. Few have any experience in organizing, and many have little experience in cooperating on a group level, unquote. Blau identifies the homeless as a demobilized population whose abilities to develop their own social movement are minimized by poverty, self-blame, and physical or emotional incapacities. He describes homeless political advocacy in terms of a social movement for the homeless, rather than a social movement of the homeless. The virtual absence from the literature of accounts of militant or politically conscious homeless people may reflect the tendency of researchers to study the poor at the point of maximum disempowerment. It's not surprising to find that studies, conducted exclusively at soup kitchens, shelters, or hospital emergency rooms, document a high degree of stress, disorganization, and depression. Conclusions are then drawn from such studies, often of the recently evicted, unemployed, or hospitalized, and then applied or generalized onto the entire population, even though the long-term homeless or the episodically homeless may not fit the characterizations. Additionally, the advocacy strategy widely employed in the 1980s may require the public presentation of a group to be pitied and who pose no social threat, rather than the presentation to the public of a group marked by anger or potential unrest, which could jeopardize charitable contributions. See Marcue's 1988 for a similar conception of how American society's response to homelessness in the 1980s focused on neutralizing its potential political impact. In contrast to much previous research, but consistent with a smaller body of work which reveals the strengths of homeless people, this article presents research which focuses on a group of homeless people not identified through shelters or service agencies, but through a list of homeless demonstrators who were then interviewed 3 years after a tent city protest, 1987 to 1990. Comment, so in other words, rather than finding the people to interview for this study through a shelter or service agency, they found them by talking to homeless people who were engaged in political demonstration. Continuing, revisiting a group of homeless people shows considerable social changes over time, strengths in social ties, group affiliation, and political mobilization. In addition to the lack of literature on the mobilized homeless, few analytic studies exist of the social movements of the poor in recent years. It can be argued that the decline of various 1960s movements has resulted in fewer poor people's movements to study. There's a footnote there. An alternative explanation would suggest that much protest by poor people in recent decades has emerged on the local level, is often spontaneous, and has not been led by major organizations. Hence, it may not be that social movements and protests by the poor are absent as much as underreported by media and social scientists, because it's not led by major organizations that can make the bigger waves that get onto the media, etc. Not only homeless protests, but many tenant, minority, worker, or welfare protests in the 1980s and 90s occurred locally without national infrastructure or communication networks of the major social movement industries studied by the Resource Mobilization School. Continuing, it is also true that following groups of poor people over time is quite difficult. Members of groups engaging in militant protest are likely to be suspicious of researchers and therefore reluctant to participate in research. Poor people in particular are more difficult to locate than middle-class participants in social movements, since poor people move more, often do not have telephones, and in the case of homeless people, may have no addresses at all. Also, both the stigmatization of the poor, welfare recipients, for example, may not wish to be identified as such, and mobility patterns. The subject who is no longer on welfare may not wish to identify with the status, mitigate against studies of poor people's activism. Nevertheless, we argue that the orientation of social movement theorists themselves tend to minimize studies of poor people. For the last decade and a half, the, quote, resource mobilization school has generally dominated the discussion of social movements. While resource mobilization, or RM theory, was a theoretical advance, its focus on differential organizational structures of social movement organizations and differential patterns of elite involvement in mobilization serves to minimize attention to spontaneous movements of the poor. Critics argue that RM's sole focus on permanent organizations and elite involvement does not accurately describe the social movements of the very poor. Piven and Cloward in 1991 remark, for example, that the focus leaves out a large number of spontaneous and disruptive protests, from the ghetto riots of the 1960s to food riots in the Third World, because disruptive protests are not normalized, routinized social movements spearheaded by organizations and organizational infrastructure. Foss and Larkin in 1986 suggested that the current sociological preoccupation with studying organization subordinates collective action and dissident behavior by encouraging analysis of movement representatives and their organizations rather than the participants' own actions and motivations. As McAdam notes, excluded groups lack conventional resources and inducements to effect change, but must rely on negative inducements and disruption. Indeed, since groups like the homeless have only their bodies and time as resources, and at least thus far, no national organization has come close to really organizing this population, we would argue that most protests by the homeless are generally spontaneous and episodic, local in nature, and disruptive in strategy. The focus on organizations may obscure the obvious fact that the gains of social movements, at least for the poor and other disenfranchised people, should accrue to participants and their class, not to an organizational entity. A second trend in social movement research has been a focus on the, quote, new social movements. Some theorists have challenged the assumption of rational self-interest in collective behavior and argued that social movements composed of middle-class people tend to be moralistic movements, which cannot be reduced to tangible incentives. A growing number of studies of moral social movements based in the middle class have emerged: the anti-nuclear movement, the divestment movement, the environmental movement, and the animal rights movement. While such studies provide important information about the motivations of middle-class participants, they tell us little about the likely motives of participants in poor people's movements and obviously minimize the impact of tangible resource gains as a motive or effect of protest. Participants' views of poor people's movements. Though there is a small sociological literature on the impact of protest on middle-class participants' lives, mostly recent studies of the impact of 1960s social movements, we know almost nothing about experiences of participants in poor people's movements and the potential impact of movements on their lives. By analyzing the impact of a localized social movement on homeless people, this article suggests various areas of theoretical explanation that have been absent in studies of the poor. First, to what degree do participants who are poor believe their movements have led to gains in material resources? Although we have strong suggestive correlational data indicating ghetto rioters and welfare rights organization members gained material resources through their activism in the 1960s, we have very little data from participants themselves. This study allows for direct sociological evidence as to participants' own viewpoints of tangible resource gains from their participation in a poor people's movement. Secondly, several authors have suggested that tangible material gains may ultimately be a weak inducement to movement participation. Stressing non-material incentives, McAdam, for example, found a resocialization process in which movement participants, quote, reorganized their biographies into a before and after to be a major result of the Freedom Summer. We need to explore the extent to which poor people can develop moral or solidarity attachments to social movements. Is resocialization into a moral or ideological basis for protest possible in poor people's movements? And is it consistent with the struggle for material gains? Finally, we shall explore the differential gains of movement participants from non-participants. An early maxim in social movement theory, Olson, 1965, suggests that social movements must develop selective incentives that accrue to participants themselves to prevent the free rider problem. Why participate if the same gains would accrue to you by not taking risky action? To what extent do even relatively spontaneous and loosely organized poor people's movements developed such selective incentives for participation. Context. The 1980s brought the realities of homelessness to the state of Maine. Despite Maine's predominantly rural and small-town character, the effects of deindustrialization, combined with the increased cost of housing and cuts in social benefit programs, led to the increased visibility of homeless people by the mid-1980s. Portland, with a metropolitan area population of 150,000, as Maine's largest city and employment center, quickly became the largest center of homeless people, with some estimates of homelessness reaching 2,000 people a year by 1990. In July 1987, as a result of the closing of 2 emergency homeless shelters, a protest was initiated by an ad hoc organization called the Coalition for the Dignity of the Homeless and Poor. Beginning with an occupation of Portland City Hall, homeless protesters proceeded to a nearby park and established a tent city after threats of arrest. This encampment lasted nearly a month. The demonstration, with over 100 live-in participants, attracted not only regional media attention, but the intervention of nationally known homeless advocate Mitch Snyder. Snyder came to Portland and helped to negotiate a settlement with city officials only after threatening to shut down the city and bring prominent figures to march in Portland. The local newspapers noted the high level of social organization present as the tent city evolved. Participants organized security patrols for safety, limited alcohol and drug use to prevent arrests, organized job and clothing banks, established centers for donations, organized shower facilities, and held frequent strategy meetings and political forums for the community. Participants even conducted surveys in which they counted the city's homeless and asked basic demographic questions. Footnote on that, researchers obtained 63 completed fact-finding questionnaires, which were filled out by participants during the Tent City protest. These forms contain simple data such as age, birthplace, length of time in Portland, employment and social benefit status, the length of time spent homeless, and experiences with city shelters. Many participants did not fill out questionnaires. Back to the main text. The homeless abandoned the encampment only after the city agreed to open several year-round shelters, liberalize the General Assistance Welfare Program, waive restrictive requirements for welfare such as workfare, and provide the homeless with representation on a variety of city boards. While these gains may appear modest in view of the structural causes of poverty and homelessness, the protest did have some radical effects on the conditions of many homeless people in the area, as we shall explore. Additionally, the protest led to the development of a number of loosely organized homeless grievance committees. In the winter of 1989 to 1990, for example, 3 different groups vied to file grievances over shelter conditions and other issues in the city. At one point, nearly 30 homeless or formerly homeless people were carrying beepers as they served as peer advocates to other homeless people. City officials complained they couldn't make a move without protest or obstruction from these groups. Methodology as discovery, the homeless community. In order to identify and locate a cohort of homeless people, conduct in-depth interviews, capture the texture of their lives, and determine changes over time, researchers must become an accepted and trusted part of the low-income community. The authors had been involved in assisting a political advocacy group which emerged from the Tent City movement, attending its meetings, talking to participants, and advising the leadership. Additionally, both researchers were affiliated at the time with a major service provider to the homeless and very poor in Portland. Once legitimacy was secured, the researchers approached the leaders of the homeless movement with a plan for a follow-up study to locate the Tent City participants, determine their current housing and income status, and conduct in-depth interviews focused on their backgrounds and experiences of homelessness. Leaders shared a list of 63 Tent City participants who had signed a Coalition for the Dignity of the Homeless and Poor membership list in early July 1987. The list had limitations. Some individuals had signed only their first names, others had given aliases or nicknames. As the research began, each subject located was asked what other people they remembered from Tent City. The list grew from the original 63 names to 105. While any effort to secure a perfect cohort from what was essentially a spontaneous crowd is subject to limitations, cohort names were repeatedly checked with protest leaders, social service workers, ministers, and participants themselves for accuracy. Some names were eliminated when it was determined that individuals had not been homeless at the time or were not involved with Tent City, while other names were added. Indicative of the high level of social contact between the subjects, Signatures of first names only and aliases often did lead to full identification and location after discussion with other cohort members. The study confirmed the existence of strong social ties and social networks among the homeless and formerly homeless. Hardly a group of isolated individuals, subjects were not only able to provide leads on almost all members of the cohort, but more than 80% of located subjects maintained close social relationships with their comrades from Tent City after 3 years. Several women dubbed as mothers of the street, themselves formerly homeless, housed and fed homeless people, and often knew where as many as 20 subjects were at any given time. Other subjects were strongly involved with church groups, self-help groups, and political movements. Subjects continually asked researchers where so-and-so had gone to. Those who were located away from the area spoke with fondness of their time in Portland. Quoting Arnie, a 35-year-old man now living with his parents in Florida, "I'll always remember the friends I made on the streets in Portland. We stuck together. There was a real community up there." And quoting Marianne, a 27-year-old woman now in jail, "We were like a family at Tent City. People took care of one another. I felt needed, wanted, connected to them." Since the study was conducted over a 6-month period, locations often changed, but a large number of subjects were able to update the research list. "He's in jail now. She moved out of town to Bangor. She wrote to me, and here's the new address." While 65 full-length interviews were completed, see Table 1 on the screen there, considerable information was gathered on all but 5 of the Tent City cohort, leading to a database on almost all protest participants. However, for some subjects, locational information was too vague to pursue. "He's living in Arizona where he found work," or "she's gone somewhere in Massachusetts where she has a family." 2 subjects had died. 6 subjects were located but refused to be interviewed, and 8 subjects were found and spoken to, but due to the exigencies in the low-income community, a full interview could not be completed. For example, 1 subject answered half the research questions but needed to terminate the interview. When the research assistant attempted to find the subject to reschedule, he found the subject had moved to another city. Repeated efforts to locate his whereabouts were successful, but 2 succeeding attempts to interview him failed. While the Tent City cohort represents a small and non-random sample, local observers note that the protest included the vast majority of Portland's non-family homeless adults during the second week of July 1987. Footnote there, the Coalition for the Dignity of the Homeless and Poor conducted a survey of the homeless during the second week of Tent City, which counted 174 people as being homeless. According to press reports and the Coalition, the 105 Tent City participants made up a majority of Portland's homeless at this time. They also note that Portland's homeless families were provided for by better shelter and social benefits. Although no control group of homeless people who did not participate in the protest could be systematically obtained, researchers met at least 3 dozen people who had been homeless in that July of 1987, but who did not participate in Tent City. Table 2 provides demographic data about the cohort. That's on the screen here, and you can see breakdowns by gender, age, education, place of birth, and the socioeconomic class of their family of origin. Material resource gains from the protest. In the process of locating the cohort of Tent City participants, researchers were struck with the changes over the 3 years in the areas of housing and social welfare benefits. Most significantly, the majority of subjects were housed at the time of the study. Definitions of homelessness vary. The advocates define homelessness as, quote, lacking a permanent and customary home, which includes those who are institutionalized or doubled up. Social scientists have generally preferred a measure of literal homelessness, which is characterized as sleeping in homeless shelters or other places not intended as dwellings. Table 3A categorizes subjects by both definitions. There you can see Table 3A, where you see housed versus homeless, and then a breakdown under homeless of street and shelter, correctional setting, rehab facility, with family or with friends. Among the 65 subjects who were interviewed, 50, or almost 77%, were housed in the spring and summer of 1990, even under the fairly rigorous definition of the advocates. If the literal homeless definition is used, 58 of the 65 subjects, or 89.2%, were housed at the time of the study. Although data on the remainder of the cohort is more tentative, since they were not subjects of in-depth interviews, considerable information from a family, friends, or others was available to confirm that the non-interviewed group showed a similar pattern. Of the 98 people about whom information was available at the time of the study, 83 out of the 98, or 84.7%, were housed using the more literal definition of homelessness, while 70 of the 98, or 71.4%, were housed according to the advocate's definition. Another important quantifiable change in the tent city cohort was that while there was almost no change in the number of subjects who were employed, there was a dramatic change in the number of subjects receiving social benefits. This is shown on Table 4 on the screen here. In early July 1987, when subjects filled out questionnaires, only 1 in 12 subjects received any assistance. In 1990, over 70% were receiving benefits. While there were 4 or 5 success stories of formerly homeless people who had experienced significant upward mobility since 1987. One subject, for example, currently works as a welder for $15 an hour. For the most part, the successful subjects remained quite poor, but at least were able to remain housed through the income support of Social Security, SSI, AFDC, General Assistance Welfare, or Veterans Benefits. While there can be imprecision in documenting changes over a 3-year period, reports by study participants, by advocates for the homeless and the poor, and by city officials interviewed for this study attributed the changes to the impact of Tent City. For example, subjects spontaneously mentioned the Tent City protest in describing various changes in their lives over the last 3 years. Quoting Cora, a 21-year-old formerly homeless woman now residing in a one-room apartment, Tent City was a big turning point for me. I became one of the captains, had to patrol for security, keep booze out. I had to negotiate with the city. I wasn't drunk at Tent City because, I had something to do, like I was too busy for it. It helped me to enter rehab afterwards. Quoting Hal, a 26-year-old formerly homeless man, I had never gotten involved with politics before Tent City, but I've been active ever since. A whole bunch of us went to Washington, D.C. in October 1989, March on Washington for Housing and Aid to the Homeless. There was so many of us, it was real cool. Being involved has really made me proud to call myself homeless. Even though I have a place now, I still think of myself that way. Quoting Stan, a 32-year-old formerly homeless man now housed and working as a building manager, at Tent City time, this was the first time the city ever helped me. I had been denied over and over again for welfare. But then they just came out and said, okay, let's give you some city food stamps and a housing voucher. What a change. The conclusion that dramatic changes in housing and social benefit status were the result of a clearly unusual event, a local social movement, rather than the natural fluidity of homelessness, is also supported when we see that the 3-year period coincided with an increase in unemployment, a continued steep rise locally in housing costs, and a continued rise in the number of homeless people locally. Prior to the July 1987 protest, several local factors, consistent with national trends, exacerbated the problems of the very poor in southern Maine. Shelter space was inadequate in Portland and non-existent outside the city. Shelters were run exclusively by private agencies who were often categorically limited, for example, only alcoholics, and they often required behavioral compliance, such as church attendance. Comment, that's completely sickening to me. Attending church is not going to do anything for you. And also, religious homeless shelters are widely noted by those with knowledge and experience in this area to be among the worst when it comes to religious, private, secular, and public shelter-type organizations and institutions. Continuing. Also, a boom in real estate development and gentrification in southern Maine had caused a dramatic rise in housing costs in the area and a severe shortage of low-income housing. While local welfare funds were technically available for rent supplementation, Portland's housing allowance was below the minimal rents available. Moreover, general assistance, or local welfare, could not be used for security deposits and was unavailable for supplementation if the recipient had any source of income or savings. So literally, you just wouldn't qualify unless you were like the guy on the Monopoly card with the pockets turned out. Yeah. Finally, the General Assistance Program, the only benefit available for single, non-disabled people or married couples with no young children, was a non-cash program, consisting only of vouchers for housing, food, medical care, or other expenses. Recipients had to have an address to receive it, had to agree to workfare obligations to be eligible or work requirements, and had to spend all savings or other benefits or work income to receive it. Again, essentially maintaining yourself at a zero cash level in order to do this. That's an extraordinarily vulnerable situation. Also, it incentivizes people to do off-books cash transactions for, employment, pay, whatever. By making themselves visible to the public, the protesters put pressure on the service system to respond to individuals who previously had been excluded by the restrictions on shelter and welfare assistance. Catherine, a 19-year-old homeless woman at the time of Tent City, discusses how she got AFDC benefits during the protest in a manner that is reminiscent of welfare protests of the 1930s and 1960s. Quote, "I couldn't get relief for the longest time. I was in this catch-22 situation because my child had been taken away from me, so they said I wasn't eligible for AFDC, but I couldn't get my child back unless I had income and a place to stay. Then we went down to welfare as a group from Tent City. City Hall didn't deny me then. It didn't deny my sister or any of us. All of a sudden, we were eligible for assistance." Unquote. Pressure was exercised by protesters themselves on behalf of their peers, who constantly threatened the city government with exposure through a suddenly responsive media. Sam discusses the fate of Wally, then a 74-year-old street person with throat cancer. Quote, "Here was this guy, Wally, weak, living in the park. He couldn't talk from the cancer, and the city, the state, no one would help him. Not his family either. They had abandoned him. We confronted the head of social services and said, okay, you want this guy on the 6 o'clock news tonight, or are you going to help him? The next thing you know, he got food stamps, welfare, and Medicaid." Unquote. City officials confirmed that the Tent City protest created a panic at City Hall, particularly as increasing media attention centered on Portland. A July 23, 1987 memo was issued by city officials ordering social service personnel to go to the encampment and to approve all protesters for immediate relief, total departure from normal procedure, as well as to try to make housing placements for all homeless protesters. Some changes coming out of the settlement, negotiated in July 1987, did affect all homeless people. For the first time, the city recognized the right to shelter and agreed to provide municipal shelters. By the winter of 1987 to 88, the number of shelter beds had been increased 50%. Importantly, the number of beds open to non-categorical clients went up dramatically. For the first time, any client without housing was deemed eligible for shelter assistance and general assistance welfare. Several administrative changes in welfare affecting both formal rules and informal discretionary policies were implemented. The city temporarily suspended its workfare requirements, which had been a major source of unrest among the single homeless population. The address requirement for assistance was removed, and the presumed eligible rule allowed homeless people to receive welfare for shelter, food, travel, and medicine. Also, by changing the formula for direct assistance to allow some income to count for rent, the city, in an indirect way, began to finance security deposits and subsidize housing for a period of time, making one more change, and the city agreed to raise its housing allotment for shelter. The link between assistance benefits and housing status was critical. In a tight housing market with a 2 to 3% vacancy rate, landlords were able to maintain high rents and impose considerable obstacles to rental by poor people. A client rejected by the city welfare was virtually consigned to the streets, but even those approved for general assistance were often unable to meet the cost of rent plus security deposit. As Cora, an 18-year-old homeless street person in 1987, and Mitch, a 28-year-old homeless man, describe, the changes in welfare made a substantial difference. Quoting Cora, "During Tent City, I found this place on Spring Street. It was pretty nice. But the city never would agree to give me the 2-month security deposit that the landlord wanted. But then they said, okay, we know these ministers, and they can get together and get the deposit paid. We will pay the ministers from next month's welfare benefits." This was a really different city welfare department. Quoting Mitch, "I had been evicted by this guy, and suddenly when I went to welfare, the city said, he'll take you back. We'll give him 2 months security, so it's all set. I was stunned." While the city of Portland keeps no record of welfare provided to the homeless, the trend in acceptances to welfare reflects the improvements made as a result of the settlement. Acceptances went from 72% in the first half of 1987 to over 77% in the second half of 1987, which meant that on a monthly basis, over 150 more applicants were being approved for welfare. The distribution of social benefits is hardly routine. In actuality, Administration of social programs is political, and alternating liberalization and contraction is related to social unrest and resource mobilization on the local and societal levels. Like the social structural changes revealed by studies of the protests of the 1930s and 1960s, political pressure on social welfare agencies in Portland produced considerable changes in the 1987 to 88 period. Further, like Piven and Cloward's discussion of the indirect effect of the 1960s protests, increased acceptance onto the welfare rolls was not an intended consequence of the protest, but was an unintended impact greatly due to the more structural changes like housing or employment not being as easily affected by protesters or the city government. Another unintended change precipitated by the protest was the growing number of homeless people accepted for non-city social benefits, Social Security, SSI, and AFDC. During the protest, anti-poverty lawyers recruited to assist the demonstrators on a daily basis provided information and advocacy. Sam, a 24-year-old street person with a sporadic history of psychiatric admissions following the death of his partner and child in a car accident, provides an example. Quote, "I had applied and been turned down for SSI again and again, but now the people at the tent city said, 'Hey, go to this lawyer, file suit, he'll help you.' It took a while, but then about 6 months later, I finally got it, and I got a retroactive check for all those years. Got my apartment with a retroactive settlement." Unquote. It's also important to recognize that some material resources were not successfully achieved. The protesters raised the issue of jobs and put considerable pressure on local employers, but there was little or no improvement. Billy, a 25-year-old participant in the protest, remembers several employers coming to Tent City, but no one obtaining jobs. Quote, "They came down to the park where the protest was taking place and said, 'Hey, we've got jobs, come on down, if you people really want to work.' And it was a joke, a publicity stunt with some of them. This guy who had just fired me 2 weeks before was there. I said to him, 'Okay, so you have jobs? I'll work.' And he said, 'No, you have to have an address to work in my place.'" Unquote. Non-material resource gains from the protest. Most analysts of social movements have stressed the non-material gains of movements, whether viewed as solidarity, empowerment, disalienation, resocialization, or purposive and solidary incentives. Often, these critical impacts of movements are only vaguely specified, or reduced to a kind of psychological state. While agreeing with the importance of psychological, social network, and affiliational gains of movements, we also argue that for poor people, such overtly non-material resources often translate into material resources. Since poor people are systematically cut off from many social ties which generate empowerment, they lack access to people and social networks available to middle-class people, to organizations, to information, and to skills. Yet they may gain access to these material resources as a result of movement participation. Access to higher income people. The ability of the protesters to mobilize resources on a group level led to a little documented type of individual resource mobilization, the involvement of people in the community who materially aided homeless people. For example, Ruth, a 21-year-old who had been on the streets of Portland for 3 years, was befriended by a local minister during the protest. Quote, "Meeting someone like Holly was amazing. Just that she would let me sleep on her floor and have a place where no one would attack me was really something. And she helped me. She talked to me, helped me pay for an abortion, and then convinced me to go to a local alcohol rehab center." Unquote. When interviewed in 1990, Ruth and the minister had left Maine and were living in a previously condemned building they had purchased and rehabilitated together. Louise, another young homeless person, made friends at Tent City with a woman who was volunteering her time to the homeless. Louise credits the friend with helping her get out of homelessness by giving her shelter and preventing her from going back to her abusive boyfriend. Quote, "She took me in, and every night she stayed up with me and talked to me, just to keep me there, because I kept wanting to go back to Tom and be with him on the street. She kept telling me, 'Let's play cards, let's do this,' so I stayed there. She knew he abused me and that it was no good, but if she hadn't stayed with me, I'd be back there with him on the streets." Unquote. While the literature often relegates such acts of friendship to the category of expressive ties, we would argue that where social ties are with higher status actors, such relationships should also be seen as a form of resource mobilization, in that they allow excluded groups access to housing, food, and clothing, even if temporarily, and to social networks of middle-class citizens, which can lead to employment or upward mobility. For example, Ruth, still living with her friend the minister, is now a computer operator, and Louise met her husband, a building contractor, through her girlfriend. Organizational attachment. Organizations have been frequently studied by social movement analysts for their capacity to provide resources for protest. Yet, it often is protest that breeds organization. From one ad hoc emergency group formed by 3 people in July 1987, the Coalition for Dignity, the Tent City protests spawned a variety of consumer groups and organizations. For example, 3 separate homeless advocacy groups have been formed by 1989, a new urban ministry for the poor, a host of new self-help groups, and several new service agencies emerged, many with consumer representation. In addition to meeting needs for affiliation, help with a variety of problems, access to information, and skill building, organizational affiliation can also directly or indirectly provide material resources. For example, Joel, a 43-year-old formerly homeless person, was hired by the Portland Coalition for the Psychiatrically Labeled, a consumer advocacy group, as a peer advocate. Amy, a 38-year-old sporadically homeless mentally ill woman who is involved with 4 self-help groups, including the Portland Coalition, as well as a political advocacy group, sees her involvement as having directly helped her to secure government aid. Quote, "Some people want to get all they can, and I'm in this category too. I want more and more, and why not? And the city is now very responsive to me. I guess they know that I'm in touch with all these groups. They kind of have this attitude like, take care of Amy, and that's fine with me." Laughs. Unquote. Information. Poor people frequently lack access to information about benefits and resources. Services are linked to income and status either formally, through insurance coverage, or through informal controls over clientele, such as waiting lists and the use of referral to other agencies. It is widely recognized that providers often prefer more affluent clients. As a result of the protest, social agencies became more responsive to the homeless. For example, almost all alcohol and drug rehabilitation centers in Maine work on a fee-for-service basis and generally do not accept homeless people. These agencies require applicants to demonstrate good prognoses by having a home, job, and partners to help in the recovery process. Yet at Tent City, service providers suddenly began accepting referrals of homeless people. Tiny, a 59-year-old man who had been on the streets for 2 years and had a serious problem with alcohol abuse, recalls, quote, "It was at Tent City that I began thinking about going into rehab, but also this guy from a detox center, he came down and talked to me. He said he could also get me into the rehab center by sponsoring me. This surprised me because I knew that the place was only for people with money." Unquote. Skills. Experience in protest also translates into the accumulation of individual skills, gaining literacy, talking to the media and to public officials, organizing and conducting meetings, writing, and public speaking. Quoting Tim, a 22-year-old homeless man who, after 4 years on the street, became active in Tent City, "This really got me active. I became an advocate for the homeless and an activist, now always since then, and it's gotten me a new respect, begrudgingly, from the city and others, as I make out reports, speak to the press, and so on." Quoting Mitch, a 31-year-old formerly homeless man, "I began helping out on the computers at the Amity Center, a self-help group. I had only a few skills from when I was working a bunch of years ago, but I've gotten good, and now they've agreed to send me to this program, a computer training program, so that I can work more full-time." Disalienation. Finally, the personal impact of protest movements must be noted. Rather than the vague term empowerment, Foss and Larkin's concept of disalienation, in which excluded groups no longer accept their, quote, socialization to subordinate positions in the social structure, but reinterpret reality in order to convert stigmatization and subordination to a badge of honor, provides an understanding of the changed consciousness that protest can produce. For many, though hardly all the protesters interviewed, the change was an ideological one. Quoting Arnie, a 35-year-old subject, "Politically, I've come to be left of center from my experiences at Tent City. I saw how the city didn't want to listen and how they just wanted to repress us. This really opened my eyes. I hadn't really thought of myself as part of an oppressed group before." Unquote. This change in consciousness also leads to behavioral changes in many formerly homeless subjects, where, even after securing housing, they continue to associate with homeless people and act in concert with them. Just as Snow and Anderson found strong evidence of role embracement among some homeless people. We found that such embracement persisted even after housing was secured. Quoting Telly, a 22-year-old man working as a security guard who has lived in a one-room apartment for 2 years, "It's funny. I used to be ashamed to be seen at the shelter and soup kitchens. Now I figured, I fought for the shelter, I might as well use it. I know maybe this sounds weird, but these are my folks down there." Quoting Agnes, a 23-year-old homeless woman, discussing how she got into trouble in her job at a fast food restaurant. "Boy, they made a big mistake with me, ordering me, of all people, to chase the homeless out of the restaurant. I said, wait a minute, they have nowhere to go. They're having coffee. No, I'm not chasing them out. You can fire me, I don't care. I'll call the coalition and we'll protest." Discussion. Material gains for participants. Clearly, the homeless protesters of Portland obtained considerable tangible gains as a result of the protest, most particularly in the area of housing and social welfare benefits. Subjects described their participation in Tent City and in subsequent local and national protests as motivated by the desire to secure housing, income benefits, jobs, and other material resources from an unresponsive system. The tangible benefit gains for homeless movement participants stand in contrast to the pessimism about the ability of the homeless to alter their plight, much less mobilize on their own. It also contrasts with the almost total exclusion of the value of material benefit gains from recent social movement literature. In our case study, homeless participants with access only to resources of time and their own bodies engaged in disruptive tactics which briefly blocked normal city government operations and threatened local governmental legitimacy. While a few of the movement leaders and participants were vaguely aware of other homeless movements, the activities of Mitch Snyder, and the sense that there were tent cities and other locales, the protest occurred in isolation from any well-organized financial sponsors, organizational infrastructure, or national, or even regional communication network. Of course, protesters were able to pressure only the most available target, the local government, and hence they were able to alter only the provision of resources such as welfare benefits, shelter provision, and housing assistance available. Since the protest was local, structurally separated from other sectors of society, and commanded few powerful resources, its ability to alter state and federal government and private sector decision-making was nil. Hence, like the strategy of the welfare rights movement years earlier, the broader social structural causes of poverty were not altered, but only the immediate issues of housing, food, and shelter, for which local government holds a legitimate mandate, could be addressed. Importantly, the case example reminds us, irregardless of how deeply structural the causes of poverty, localized movements can achieve some dramatic gains in areas that do fall within the discretion of local officials. In this sense, local movements can be highly successful, though they often do not receive the attention of media or social scientists. From material gains to solidarity movements. The strong identification that most tent city participants had with other homeless people and with their movement, and the more general movement of other poor people, indicates the potential for struggles around material benefits to breed solidarity sentiments. Through the month-long occupation, the public clashes and marches in the streets, the long hours of negotiation with the city, homeless protesters came, as Arnie stated, to see themselves as an oppressed group. Like McAdams' Freedom Summer participants, many of the tent city protesters underwent a re-socialization process and, quote, reorganized their biographies into a before and after the tent city protest experience. Commenting, I think it's really important, this notion of whether people see themselves as part of an oppressed group or not. Right now in the United States, not to a person, but overall there is kind of a tendency to have this upside-down situation, where conservative people, who often are active in perpetrating bigotry and oppression, consider themselves to be the oppressed. And then meanwhile, actually oppressed people have been sold on this narrative of you can't become a victim and whatever else, and basically no matter how bad it gets, not considering yourself to be in need of assistance, struggling, whatever it is. The overall outcome of this is that you have a group of oppressors that actually see themselves as the victim and therefore just absolutely have no check whatsoever, just detached from reality in terms of their behavior and the way that they relate to people outside of their group. And then extreme demoralization among the actually oppressed people who have just been taking a lot of these hits and a lot of this oppression for years and years and years, well past the point of dignity, and when something should have been done in a much more organized or at least more forceful way long ago. And instead the situation is deteriorated. There's that long-standing saying that Americans, no matter how poor they are, tend to view themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. In other words, there's this over-identification with the big bourgeoisie, rich people, even among people who themselves are not even close to being rich, who probably in 5 generations would have no hope of anyone from their family even becoming rich. In this way, it seems like people's ideology is really at odds with reality itself. There's a sort of war on reality in these last few decades, which is demoralizing, like I said, and leads to many outcomes which are also demoralizing. But just it in and of itself is sort of a mass denial of reality, which really does not serve anyone who would in fact benefit from a change in the social situation. Anyway, continuing. Rather than suggest that ideological, moral, or psychological motivations for protest contrast with material gains, the opposite point might be made. In contrast to the strategy of lengthy litigation employed throughout the 1980s by professional advocates, the use of disruptive strategies by the very poor may not only be arguably quicker and more sweeping than advocacy, but it is possible that only direct action can develop the consciousness raising and empowerment necessary for solidarity ties. The experience of comradeship, of success, no matter how brief or incremental, and of a collective orientation to change, moved the vast majority of subjects, almost none of whom had prior political experience or ideological ties, to become activists, or at least firmly support protest movements. 3 years after Tent City and the first creation of grievance committees in Portland, homeless and formerly homeless people continue to occupy seats on several city boards as well as in a number of service agencies. Groups representing the homeless appear at shelters, soup kitchens, and City Hall to protest a wide variety of administrative actions. Such self-representation and capacity to mobilize would not have been possible had the homeless relied only on professional advocates to plead their case through legal or legislative action or through appeals to the public for charity and sympathy. Commenting, that's really excellent point, how praxis and actually getting out there and struggling raises consciousness in a way that, just sort of abstract studies can't do. They can supplement that, but the fastest way by far is through actual practice. And when we talk about, the political situation, when will there be a communist movement emerging or whatever, and I've been saying more and more, stressing this more and more as we go into another presidential cycle and all of this stuff, 2024 starts to loom. Until we rebuild the labor movement in an actually militant way that's not just run by union bureaucrats and lawyers, until you actually see a resurgence of the major proletarian organizations that fight for proletarian class interests, you're not really going to see, I don't think, the accompanying or attached and subordinate political struggle, the conquest of political power by the proletariat. You're not going to see that parallel political struggle really take any kind of shape. You're going to have populist uprisings that are going to be unformed, contrarian, and basically lead nowhere, such as the Green Party right now, I think is leading into another one of those. Doesn't have a specifically socialist character. Again, more of this populist sort of outlet for anger, but that is not especially focused or class conscious. This, opens that kind of a movement up for co-opting by the right wing. Before you know it, you're working with Tucker Carlson. You can see this in The Hills Rising, this whole creation of this populist infrastructure and faux left. Anyway, the point is that, as this says, the experience of comradeship, of success, no matter how brief or incremental, and of a collective orientation to change, moved the vast majority of subjects, almost none of whom had prior political experience or ideological ties, to become activists or at least firmly support protest movements. So again, we need struggle. Weak struggle equals weak vanguard, the vanguard just being the most class conscious and most historically literate, most studied part of the working class. Weak struggle, weak class consciousness, therefore a weak vanguard. And all of this, it sort of comes back to, is the working class struggling? If not, don't expect any change. All right, continuing. Importantly, such transformations are not automatic or universal. In this study, 9 subjects told interviewers that they would not support or participate in another tent city or similar protest. So, again, not universal, though that is the overall tendency. Louis, the 37-year-old formerly homeless man now employed as a welder, was typical of these few subjects. Quote, "Oh no, I won't do this protest again. I have a place now and a job, and no, I don't hang out with an activist from Tent City," or name of another activist from Tent City. "They really screwed me up," unquote. As social movement theorists have indicated, the best predictor of association with the social movement is the nature and strength of potential participant social networks. Louis had a major falling out with several protest leaders 3 years ago, subsequently moved to another city, and does not continue contact with any of his friends from Tent City. Like Louis, others who were now hostile to protest movements had the most minimal social network ties of the study subjects. We also found that demographic factors related to continued movement association. In this study, social class of origin, poor or working class more than middle class, age, under 40 more than over 40, and gender, men more than women, remained more positively committed to political militancy. The gains of participants versus non-participants. While the study had no systematic control group, several dozen homeless and ex-homeless people who did not participate in Tent City, but were homeless in July 1987, were interviewed in the course of the study. Several of them told us in no uncertain terms that they did not believe that they had personally gained much from the protests. Solly, a 53-year-old homeless man, complained, quote, "To tell you the truth, look at me. Tent City did nothing for me. I'm in the same place. No, I don't trust the city, the government, the protest leaders," unquote. Solly's comments were not idiosyncratic, but his basic point was confirmed by a protest leader, Catherine, when interviewed about whether non-participants gained as much from the protest as participants. Quote, "No, I guess in some cases they, the non-participants, didn't. I mean, we had to know who you were. They, the homeless, had to come to us, the group, and fill out housing placement forms. They needed to get an advocate to fight with the caseworkers over at City Hall. I guess, yeah, if they didn't do any of this, yeah, some people lost out," unquote. Solly and Catherine's comments indicate the selective incentives of social movement participation. Although some gains accrued to all homeless people because of universal changes within the city, for example, increased availability of shelter beds, many gains related to discretionary benefits, which were dependent on the homeless individual's contact with government and the strength of their ties with the indigenous homeless organization. Ballas, 1974, in his History of Massachusetts Welfare Rights Organization, MWRO, describes a point in time when the MWRO held an organizational monopoly on request forms for supplemental welfare benefits. Similarly, for several months, the Coalition for Dignity for the Homeless and Poor had a monopoly on housing assistance forms and other benefit applications for the homeless. While assistance was never formally predicated on the individual's contact with the organization, the city moved most expeditiously when the data were provided by the movement organization. In many cases, a homeless person who had not been identified and whose history had not been verified by the organization was treated with suspicion by authorities. Additionally, the coalition's leadership and the increasingly sophisticated peer advocates, assisted by a legal service organization, were able to cajole local caseworkers and city officials on behalf of participants through their knowledge of the regulations and through threats to resume protest or contact the media. Since the rules of welfare and housing assistance are arcane and involve considerable vagaries and discretion, they often remained unknown to homeless people who weren't active in the local social movement. So, commenting, as I'm always telling people, get involved in your local left network. You never know what it's going to turn up. Letting yourself get known, get some contacts in your phone, meet some people. You never know really what's going on underneath the surface. It's not all advertised, and there's a lot of benefits to getting into contact with people. Continuing. Finally, those resource gains earlier labeled as non-material clearly accrued to participants rather than non-participants. Since many of these gains in access, information, and skills can potentially translate to material resource gains for the most poor in a circular fashion, many non-participants in the local movement were doubly disadvantaged. They were not automatically sought out and given material benefits they may have been eligible for by government, nor did they have access to the information, skills, and social networks that would have assisted them in obtaining increased benefits. All right, that's the end of the audiobook, and this concludes section 2 of the Homeless Industrial Complex syllabus. There are 3 to 5 readings or other pieces of media in each section of it. Again, sections 3 through 11 still remain. I'll be trying to do one a month, intermixed with the other readings and streams and things that we do on the channel so that we can get through this. I started it back in the winter, and then in the spring I kind of let it go by the wayside. We're back. We finished section 2 for August. Going to do section 3 September, section 4 October, and so on. That is at least the plan, but this is a really good playlist. A lot of people like it. I like it. I think it's important, and we do want to get it done. So that's the plan, and it should be done next spring. All right. Otherwise, thanks for listening. Thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. Again, patreon.com/socialismforall. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, you can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. Every donation is encouraging. They're also materially helpful. I would make content even if nobody supported, but I'm able to spend much more time on it than I would otherwise be able to without this support. Also, engagement counts, so like, share, subscribe, leave comments, ask questions. Obviously, we don't really prefer the antagonistic or hostile questions. A lot of people come in with a big chip on their shoulder. That's not necessarily going to be responded to, but some good faith engagement is always welcome. If you support the channel, then support the channel. And that includes the tone of your questions and comments. But whether you're a patron or not, that engagement helps YouTube and Spotify and SoundCloud to recommend this content to other people out there who may be wondering about social problems, about capitalism, about socialism, about politics, and we can hopefully help them get on the right path. Thanks again, and we will see you in the next video.